The air in the courthouse was thick with the hum of morning activity, but in the midst of the chaos, Travis Maddox moved through it like a predator stalking its prey. His heavy boots echoed down the polished marble floors, his uniform a sharp contrast to the muted hues around him. He wasn't just any deputy, he had the badge, he had the power. And in his mind, that meant he was untouchable. Camille Rivers, a federal judge with years of experience, was already used to the feeling of eyes on her. As a black woman in a room dominated by white faces, every step she took was scrutinized. She had fought for every inch of respect she'd earned in this courthouse. Her work ethic, her sharp mind, her unflinching sense of justice, those were the qualities that had carried her through the ranks. Yet in moments like this, those qualities weren't enough to shield her from the cold undercurrent of disdain that often came her way. She wasn't looking for a fight today. In fact, she had a full docket of cases waiting for her in the courtroom. The usual clutter of motions and filings, the paperwork that never stopped. But as Camille made her way down the hallway toward her chambers, she found herself face to face with the last person she wanted to see. Travis Maddox stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. His stance was casual, too casual for the situation. His arms crossed over his broad chest as he looked down at her with an expression that was nothing short of disdainful. He didn't know her, or at least that's what he thought. But Camille was no stranger to men like him. Men who thought their badges gave them the right to demand deference. Men who believed their position in the system made them untouchable. "Excuse me, ma'am," Maddox said, his tone laced with thinly veiled mockery. "Can I see some ID?" Camille stopped. The hum of the courthouse around them seemed to fade into the background, and for a brief, electric moment, it was just the two of them. His eyes, cold and condescending, bore into hers. She could feel the tension in the air. This was no ordinary request. This was a test of whether she would comply, whether she would let him, this man who hadn't earned an ounce of the authority he wielded, control her. She knew exactly what this was about. Maddox wasn't interested in checking her credentials. He was sending a message, one that said loud and clear, "I decide who belongs here." With a steady breath, Camille met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm Judge Camille Rivers," she said coolly, her voice calm but commanding. "I don't need to show you anything." Maddox didn't move. Instead, he took a slow step toward her, his eyes flicking to the other courthouse staff milling around them. The subtle smirk that spread across his face was all too familiar. The kind of look she had seen too many times in her career. The look that said, "I'm in charge here, and you'll follow my rules." "Don't make this difficult," he muttered, his voice lowering with a tone of warning. "I'm just doing my job." Camille didn't budge. She could feel the weight of the eyes around her. She could feel the subtle shifts in the room as people watched, waiting to see what would happen. Maddox was confident, too confident. He thought his badge would protect him. He thought his power would make her step aside. But Camille wasn't some nameless clerk. She wasn't someone who could be dismissed with a glance or a sneer. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to let a man like him make her shrink in the face of his arrogance. "I'm not moving," she said, her voice unwavering, "and I don't answer to you." The space between them felt charged, as though the courthouse itself was holding its breath. Camille could feel the rising tide of tension. She knew the stakes here. If she backed down, if she let Maddox push her around, it wouldn't just be a defeat for her, it would be a defeat for everything she had worked for, everything she had fought for in this very place. Maddox's lip curled into something that barely resembled a smile. He shifted his weight, blocking her path entirely. For a moment, it seemed like the entire courthouse had stopped. The usual hum of voices, the shuffle of papers, everything seemed to fade away as they stood there, locked in this unspoken battle. But Camille's resolve was steel. Without hesitation, she lifted her chin slightly, her gaze never leaving his. "Move aside," she said, her voice steady and measured. "Now." For a heartbeat, Maddox hesitated. Then, as if realizing he wasn't going to break her, he stepped aside with a grunt, his face twisting with barely contained frustration. Camille walked past him, her stride unbroken, her head held high. The air shifted as she moved forward, but the moment wasn't over. The tension lingered, thick and palpable, like a storm on the horizon. And Camille knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a one-time confrontation. This was something much bigger. Maddox had thought she was just another black woman walking through the halls of a courthouse. He had underestimated her. And that mistake, Camille knew, would cost him. The courthouse had settled into its usual rhythm, but something in the air felt different. Camille Rivers could sense it the moment she entered courtroom 12B. She had just walked through a confrontation in the hallway, and the tension still lingered like an electric charge, humming just beneath the surface. But she couldn't let that distract her. Today was another day of cases, another day of judgment. She couldn't afford to let one deputy ruin her focus. As Camille prepared to take her seat at the bench, her mind drifted back to the events of the morning, the standoff with Travis Maddox. His behavior had been unacceptable, but it wasn't surprising. She had seen men like him before, men who believed their badge gave them the right to push people around. But she wasn't about to let Maddox get away with it, not today. The courtroom was bustling with the usual noise, attorneys talking, clerks sorting through paperwork, witnesses nervously shifting on wooden benches. But in the back of her mind, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that Maddox wasn't finished. He'd gotten under her skin, and that was exactly what he'd wanted. He wanted to rattle her, to make her question her place in the courthouse. Back in the hallway, Travis Maddox was fuming. The encounter with Camille had rattled him in ways he didn't want to admit. She hadn't flinched, hadn't backed down. That, more than anything, had gotten under his skin. He had been raised on the idea that power was something you took, not something you earned. And yet Camille, a woman of color, had stared him down without blinking. "Who does she think she is?" Maddox muttered to himself as he paced back and forth. In his mind, she didn't deserve to be where she was. A woman, a black woman, holding that position. He couldn't wrap his head around it. He was determined not to let this go. His pride was wounded, and he would make sure Camille knew it. He didn't care what rank she held. He didn't care that she was a federal judge. All he saw was a woman who had dared to challenge him, and that was a line he wasn't willing to let stand. A few hours later, Camille was walking toward the elevator banks, ready to head to another courtroom. The hallway was crowded with the usual hustle of courthouse staff, but there was an odd silence when she entered. The moment was short-lived, though, because just as she reached the call button, Maddox appeared in her path, blocking her way. "Excuse me," he said, voice low but commanding. "You need to stop." Camille stopped, her posture straight. She could feel the eyes of others around them, watching, waiting. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't show it. This wasn't the first time she'd been tested. She wasn't going to let Maddox intimidate her. Not now, not ever. "I'm in a hurry, deputy," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Move aside." Maddox didn't budge. Instead, he took a step closer, narrowing the space between them. His eyes were filled with challenge, and his stance was one of dominance. His arms crossed over his chest as if daring her to try and get past. "You think you can just walk through here like you own the place?" Maddox's voice was thick with disdain. "You're not special. You're just another person who thinks they're above the law." Camille's jaw tightened, but she didn't let his words rattle her. She had heard it all before. Just another man, too full of himself to see past the end of his own nose. But she wasn't going to play into his game. "You have no idea who you're talking to," she replied, her voice steady, but now tinged with steel. "Now step aside, or I'll have to make you." For a moment, the hallway seemed to freeze. The low murmur of voices around them quieted, the air thick with the anticipation of what would happen next. Camille held his gaze unflinching. Maddox could see the resolve in her eyes, and for the first time, he hesitated. His posture faltered slightly as the weight of her presence took hold. But then, his pride got the better of him. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside reluctantly. Camille didn't waste another second. She moved past him without acknowledging his presence, stepping into the elevator as the doors slid closed behind her. But as the elevator ascended, Camille knew this wasn't over. Maddox's arrogance wasn't something she could just ignore. He had crossed a line, and she wouldn't let him, or anyone like him, get away with it. This courthouse wasn't just a place of law and order, it was a battleground. And if Maddox thought he could break her, he had another thing coming. The elevator doors slid open, and Camille Rivers stepped out, her heels clicking firmly against the marble floors of the courthouse. The usual buzz of activity in the hallways surrounded her. But inside, there was only silence. She could feel the weight of her decision in the air. Her earlier confrontation with Maddox hadn't been a momentary flare of irritation. It had become a defining test of power. Camille knew this was bigger than a single fight. She wasn't just battling a man who believed he was above the law. She was up against a system that had allowed men like Maddox to thrive for far too long. And despite everything, despite the way the system had tried to limit her every step, Camille refused to back down. Back in the security office, Travis Maddox was seething. The embarrassment from their earlier encounter burned in his gut, and it was making him reckless. He couldn't believe how easily Camille had brushed him aside. He had expected her to shrink back, to apologize, or at the very least, hesitate. Instead, she'd walked away, unfazed. Maddox wasn't used to being made to look foolish. His badge was supposed to be his shield, his weapon to keep the peace. And yet here he was, doubting everything he thought he knew about power. Camille had broken through that shield. He paced the room, his fists clenched. She thinks she can just waltz through here like she's untouchable. He spat the words, his voice tinged with a venom he couldn't quite suppress. This wasn't about the law. It was about him feeling diminished. "I'll make her pay for this," he muttered, a cold smile creeping across his face. And that's when the plan started forming in his mind. Meanwhile, Camille was deep in thought. As much as she had dismissed Maddox's presence in the hallway, she knew his behavior wouldn't stop there. He wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. She could already hear the whispers, the way some of her colleagues would downplay the situation, dismissing it as an isolated incident. But Camille knew better. This wasn't just a clash of egos. It was about something deeper: power, authority, and respect. She couldn't let it go. Not this time. Camille entered her chambers, a room she'd spent countless hours in, signing rulings, reviewing cases, and presiding over trials. Today, though, it felt different. The walls that had once offered comfort now seemed to echo with the weight of her decision. She had to act. She could not and would not allow this to be buried under the paperwork and the noise of the courthouse. Later that afternoon, the situation took a surprising turn. As Camille reviewed case files for the afternoon session, her office phone rang. It was Captain Wilcox, the head of courthouse security. "Judge Rivers, we need to talk." His voice was low, hesitant. "There's been an incident involving Deputy Maddox. He's made a formal complaint against you." Camille's grip on the phone tightened, but she stayed composed. A formal complaint? Of course, Maddox would do this. He would twist the truth to fit his narrative, to make it look as though she was the one who had overstepped. He wouldn't stop until he had discredited her in front of the entire courthouse. "I'll be down in 5 minutes," Camille replied, her voice cool and calculated. She knew what this was. Maddox was going to try and turn the tables. He would spin the story in a way that made her look like the aggressor, to weaken her position and undermine her authority. But Camille had never been one to let someone rewrite her story. When Camille entered the security office a few minutes later, Maddox was already there, standing in front of Wilcox with an arrogant smirk on his face. The moment he saw Camille, the smile faltered just slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Judge Rivers," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "I've filed a complaint. I think you owe me an apology for your behavior this morning." Camille's gaze was steady as she looked at him. She could feel the heat of his accusation trying to settle over her like a heavy cloak, but she wasn't going to wear it. She wasn't going to play into his game. "I've done nothing to apologize for, Deputy," Camille said calmly. "You harassed me, tried to intimidate me, and now you're trying to cover it up with a lie. I will not stand for it, and I won't let you get away with it." The words landed heavily in the room, and for a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Wilcox shifted uncomfortably in his seat, sensing the tension. Maddox's bravado was beginning to waver. "Camille, please," Wilcox said, trying to ease the situation. "Let's keep this professional." But Camille wasn't having it. "I am being professional," she said, her voice unwavering. "The only one being unprofessional here is Deputy Maddox, and I'll be sure to make sure his actions today are on record." With that, Camille turned on her heel, walking out of the office without another word. She didn't need to explain herself further. Maddox had made his move, and now she was going to make hers. Back at her desk, Camille began drafting a formal report of the incident. She would make sure everything was documented every action taken, every word said. If Maddox thought he could bully his way through this, he had another thing coming. The following days were a whirlwind. Camille had submitted her formal report, documenting every detail of the confrontation with Maddox. She had even contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office, making sure they were aware of the situation. But she knew the battle wasn't over yet. If anything, it was just beginning. Maddox hadn't taken the setback well. The rumors about his complaint spread like wildfire through the courthouse. Whispers in the halls grew louder, and Camille could feel the weight of the entire building's eyes on her. Some were skeptical, others outright hostile. But there were also those who supported her, who understood the true nature of the situation. They knew that Maddox's behavior was not just a personal affront. It was a reflection of the systemic issue of power and prejudice that had been entrenched for years. As the days wore on, the courthouse became a pressure cooker, with everyone waiting to see how this conflict would unfold. Camille was more focused than ever, pushing forward with her case while refusing to let the whispers shake her resolve. She couldn't afford to be distracted, especially not when the stakes were so high. On the third day after the incident, Camille received a call from Captain Wilcox. His tone was different this time, not the usual hesitant uncertainty, but something more urgent. "Judge Rivers," Wilcox began, "I need to inform you that Deputy Maddox has been put on administrative leave, pending an internal investigation. We've received numerous complaints about his conduct in the past, and it seems this latest incident pushed things over the edge." Camille's heart didn't skip a beat. She had known something like this was coming, but it felt surreal to hear it out loud. Maddox, once so full of himself, had now been called into question by the very system that had shielded him for so long. It was a small victory, but Camille knew it was far from over. "Good," she said, her voice firm. "But this is only the beginning. I want to make sure this is more than just an internal matter. I'm taking this to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I'll make sure his history of misconduct comes to light." Wilcox hesitated before responding. "Are you sure about this, Judge? Going public could cause a lot of problems for everyone involved." "Good," Camille replied again. "Maybe it's time this courthouse had a few problems." She ended the call and looked at her desk, where her notes and case files were scattered. There was a moment of quiet, just long enough for the reality of her decision to settle in. Going public would undoubtedly bring a storm, but Camille was prepared. She wasn't going to let the system sweep this under the rug. By the next morning, the story had broken wide open. The media had caught wind of the incident, and soon enough, the courthouse was buzzing with reporters, camera crews, and outraged public figures. Camille had expected the storm, but it was still jarring to see how quickly everything had escalated. Despite the attention, Camille remained calm. She wasn't going to let the chaos rattle her. She was used to being in the spotlight. She had fought too many battles to be afraid of this one. But this was different. This time, the battle wasn't just for herself. It was for every person who had been silenced, for every person who had been dismissed by the system because of their race, their gender, their background. She stood tall as she walked into her chambers, her mind racing with the next steps. Her phone rang again. This time it was Rachel, her clerk, who had been handling media inquiries all morning. "Judge Rivers," Rachel said, her voice tight but full of determination. "There's a lot of press outside. They're asking for a statement. It's starting to get out of hand." "I'll be right there," Camille replied, her voice steady. She had to take control of this narrative. She couldn't afford to let anyone, especially Maddox, twist the story into something it wasn't. Outside the courthouse was a frenzy of activity. Reporters clustered by the front entrance, their microphones held high, shouting questions at anyone who passed. Camille stepped out of the building with a quiet confidence, her eyes meeting the sea of cameras. There was a moment of pause, as if the entire crowd was waiting for her to make her move. She walked to the podium that had been set up, the sound of her heels clicking against the concrete ringing through the air. Camille had been in many press conferences before, but today felt different. Today she wasn't just standing in front of reporters. She was standing for every person who had been overlooked, mistreated, and silenced by men like Maddox. She cleared her throat before speaking, her voice cutting through the chaos with an unmistakable authority. "My name is Camille Rivers, and I am a federal judge," she began, her words clear and steady. "Several days ago, I was physically assaulted by a courthouse deputy. This was not an isolated incident. Nor was it a misunderstanding. It was an act of intimidation, fueled by arrogance, and it will not be tolerated. There was a sharp intake of breath from the crowd, and Camille felt the weight of their attention on her. "I will not apologize for standing up to abuse of power," she continued, her eyes sweeping across the sea of reporters. "I will not be intimidated, and I will ensure that every man or woman who believes they can use their position to bully others will be held accountable. This is not just about me, it's about the system, and it's time for that system to change." With those words, Camille turned and walked back into the courthouse. The cameras flashed, but she didn't flinch. She had made her statement, and now the ball was in motion. The days that followed Camille's public statement felt like a storm gathering strength. The media coverage intensified. News outlets ran stories, some supportive, others skeptical, but all recognizing the undeniable force of Camille's resolve. The courthouse, once filled with hushed whispers and sideways glances, now buzzed with open conversations about the situation. People began to take sides, and there was no avoiding the truth any longer. The system was broken, and Camille had become its loudest critic. But amid the chaos, one thing became abundantly clear. Camille was not backing down. She was ready to push through the noise, to expose everything that had been buried for so long. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a reckoning. It was just a week later when Travis Maddox was summoned to a hearing. He had been put on administrative leave while an internal investigation was underway. But he still carried the confidence of someone who believed that his badge would shield him from any real consequences. He walked into the hearing room with a smug look on his face, his posture stiff and proud. But that pride was about to crumble. The prosecutor, Marissa Cole, a seasoned attorney who had been appointed to handle the case against Maddox, stood tall as she began her opening statement. Deputy Travis Maddox stands accused of not only assaulting a federal judge, but also of a long pattern of misconduct, harassment, and abuse of power. The evidence is overwhelming, and today we will show that Maddox's actions were not isolated. They were part of a systemic abuse of authority that cannot and will not be ignored. Maddox shifted uncomfortably in his seat as the weight of the words sank in. His defense attorney stood to object, but the damage had already been done. Camille's decision to take the matter public had changed everything. The hearing proceeded swiftly, with the prosecution introducing key evidence. The security footage from the courthouse hallway, witness statements from other staff members, and Camille's formal report, which included an account of Maddox's previous misconduct. Each piece of evidence painted a clear picture of a man who had used his badge as a weapon, who had disregarded the law and the very people he was sworn to protect. Camille sat silently in the back of the courtroom, watching the proceedings unfold. The weight of the entire system seemed to shift as the facts were laid bare. She had known from the beginning that this wouldn't be easy, but seeing the truth slowly come to light was something else entirely. She wasn't just witnessing justice being served, she was part of it. As the day wore on, Maddox's defense began to falter. His lawyer tried to argue that Camille had been the aggressor, that the situation had been blown out of proportion, but the evidence was too damning. The witnesses, many of whom had previously been too afraid to speak out, now stood tall and testified to the truth. The final blow came when the judge allowed Camille to testify. Her voice was steady, unwavering, as she recounted the moment Maddox had confronted her in the hallway. She didn't need to embellish the story. The truth was enough. She stood firm, her eyes never leaving Maddox's as she spoke. "This man," Camille said, her voice carrying across the room, "used his position to intimidate, to belittle, and to bully. He thought that because of his badge, he could do whatever he wanted. But the law is clear. No one is above it, not even him." For the first time in the hearing, Maddox's bravado cracked. His eyes darted away from hers and his shoulders sagged slightly, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up to him. After hours of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreperson's voice was clear and steady. "We find the defendant guilty on all charges." The courtroom was still for a moment, as if the very air was holding its breath. Then the verdict sank in. Maddox, the man who had thought his badge made him untouchable, was now facing the consequences of his actions. The guilty verdict was a victory not just for Camille, but for every person who had ever been oppressed by the system. Maddox was taken into custody immediately, his face a mask of disbelief. His hands were cuffed, and his once proud posture was now bent under the weight of his shame. As the deputies led him away, the room erupted into whispers. But Camille remained seated, her gaze fixed on the door through which Maddox had been escorted. She had won. It was over. But in that moment, she felt the weight of everything she had fought for, everything she had endured. The victory was sweet, but it was also bittersweet. The system had failed too many people for too long. One man's conviction wouldn't undo the damage, but it was a start. The next morning, Camille stood at the front of the courthouse, facing a throng of reporters once again. But this time, the air was different. There was no more uncertainty, no more whispers. This time, the courthouse knew. The system had been shaken. Today, Camille began, her voice steady and resolute, justice was served, not just for me, but for everyone who has been silenced, for everyone who has been made to feel less than because of their race, their gender, or their station. We have a long way to go, but we have made a step forward. She paused, letting her words sink in. This is just the beginning, she added, her voice ringing with unshakable conviction. And as she turned and walked back into the courthouse, Camille knew that the fight was far from over, but she was ready for whatever came next.